The scene begins with Pyo being chased by a group of warriors, determined to kill him. This wasn't always the case. He was once a drifter who roamed the lands, whether on land or sea. However, everything changed after he met a certain person. The scene shifts to Pyo waking up in complete darkness after a long slumber. His daily life becomes a hellish experience, filled with darkness and the presence of others who share his hatred and desperation to survive. Each day in the darkness changes Pyo, transforming him into an assassin, molded by the hellish conditions imposed on him. As the warriors chase him down, Pyo remembers the torment he endured and declares his intention to kill every one of those responsible for making him this way. The story begins within a city. Protagonist held a plate of food. The main character mentioned that he had gathered a lot and, while tossing an apple, will remark that today was a fair, so nothing was surprising. After biting into the apple, the main character stated that he needed to decide where to spend the night. In his thoughts, he introduced himself and revealed that he was 14 years old. As he walked among the passers-by, he emphasized that he was an orphan and now just a wanderer with no clear direction. Will mentioned that he had neither a home nor savings. Turning around, the main character assumed that the bridge was somewhere in the direction he was heading. He was taken aback by what he saw, a stranger standing before him. Frightened, Will asked who the man was, but the stranger remained silent, watching the main character. Will lay in the darkness, squinting before opening his eyes, surprised. The main character noted in his thoughts that his eyes were open without any doubt. Will said he was not blinded. The main character assumed it was just dark around him. Beads of sweat ran down his face as Will stated that it was pitch dark, with not a single ray of light. The main character wondered what kind of place this was. He closed his eyes in pain and screamed. Will trembled from powerlessness, noting in his thoughts that he couldn't move and couldn't gather his strength. Will asked himself how things turned out this way. Tears began to stream down his face as he remembered the plate of food. The main character recalled the outline of the stranger and how he had encountered the man. Will reflected that on the road, the main character began to think about that person, a man with a calm face who had said that Will would be useful to him. The main character assumed he was there because of that man. Will noted that he didn't know who he was and didn't even know his name. The main character pictured purple patterns, and Will wondered why the man had locked him there. The main character noticed that he didn't seem to cross anyone's path as he lay in the abyss. Will said there must be a reason for this. The main character, deep in thought, concluded that he was still alive, which meant the stranger didn't want to kill him. Lying on the floor, the main character talked about how his name was Pai-Dul, and he was 14 years old. His father's name was Pyo-Enak, and his mother's name was Lee Sien-hong. The lying protagonist reported that it was too dark around him, and frightened Will wondered whether he was unconscious or awake the entire time. The main character noted that he didn't know how much time had passed. He cried. Will, in thought, emphasized that he was scared and lonely. The main character noticed that, to avoid going crazy, he had to remember who he was. Lying in the abyss, Will continued to repeat his name. The main character asked how much longer he had to endure. Will said he was hungry. Observing the darkness, the main character stated that at this rate, he would simply die of hunger. Will noted that it would either be this, or he would go crazy. He closed his eyes and imagined himself standing in front of the man. Will wondered if the stranger wanted to starve him to death. The image of that man was reflected in his eyes. The main character asked what he did to deserve this, noting that he hadn't even asked the man for anything. Will wondered why then and for what. He bit his lip until it bled, and tears ran down his cheeks. The main character noted in his thoughts that he was just a beggar. Will wondered if that was a reason to treat him like that. The main character was able to move his hand, and he looked at it, noticing that his fingers were moving. Fall began to breathe heavily. Lying on the ground, the main character noted that it became much easier to breathe. Will reflected that he was gradually beginning to feel his body. The main character began to sniffle, looking at the wall. Will noted that it smelled damp. He began to move his leg. The main character looked at the floor beneath him and noted that it was cold. He continued to move his hand, imagining a stone wall. The main character noted in his thoughts that he was underground. He imagined a drop falling into the water, and in his mind, he saw rippling water in front of his face. Will noticed in his thoughts that water was dripping. The trembling protagonist declared that he needed a drink. He started to move his foot, frowning, and tried to roll over. Lying on his stomach, the main character said that with just a little more effort, he would manage. He started trying to get up, beads of sweat running down his face. Will began to crawl, noting in his thoughts that he had to survive. Continuing to crawl, the main character, with an angry face, noted that he would definitely survive. He crawled to the wall and began to drink water. Placing his hand on the wall, Will asked if it was a stone wall, noting that it was solid. He cut his finger on the wall, and raising his finger to his face, the main character cried out in pain. Putting his finger in his mouth, Will declared that it was useless. Sighing, he closed his eyes. The main character continued to lie on his back. A stranger, shrouded in a blue aura, approached him. Will looked at him, watching him. The main character asked in his thoughts who he was. The guy looked at Will with a surprised face and asked why he so desperately wanted to survive. The main character was taken aback by this question. The stranger remarked that it was hilarious. Walking next to him, the guy asked him to tell him what it was about his useless life that made him cling to it so much. Sitting above Will, the guy asked him to give up already, stating with a smile on his face that if the main character gave up, he would finally find peace. Awakened Will asked if he really thought so. Taken aback, the guy repeated the main character's words. Stunned, Will asked if he thought that if he gave up now, he would find peace, noting that he doubted it. The main character said with a blank look that he would survive. Frowning, the guy replied that Will was wasting his energy. Lying in the abyss, the main character said that if he died like this, he would not see peace. Will noticed that if he didn't plunge a knife into the one who locked him there, he would not find peace even after death. Inspired, the main character cried out that he would survive. He declared that he would survive at any cost and would take revenge on everyone who put him there. Sitting above Will, the guy asked if he was serious about taking revenge. The main character replied that he was. Looking at him, the stranger asked if Will was going to give up. The enraged protagonist shouted that he would never give up. A smile appeared on the guy's face. Val was suddenly surprised. Looking at the ceiling, the main character said that as he thought, nothing was visible. He wondered if it was a dream or if he was already going crazy. He began to rise. Frowning, Will said that he must survive. He leaned his hands on the wall. The main character reported that something was growing on the wall where the water was seeping from. He asked if it was moss. Putting his hand to the vegetation on the wall, Will noted in his mind that he didn't know if he could eat it, but he had no choice. He began to bring a piece of moss to his mouth. The main character began to chew the moss and in thought, noticed that to survive, he must eat. Taken aback, Will asked if something so vile could happen. The stunned protagonist said that he was fine, which meant he could eat it. Grabbing the moss on the wall, Will declared that he had to eat. Beads of sweat began to run down his face. Sitting against the wall, the main character said that he would survive no matter what. He began to walk in an unknown direction. Walking through the pitch darkness, Will held his hand on the wall while examining the area. The main character began to say that this area, as he imagined, was a square projection. Will noted in his thoughts that, judging by his calculations, it was a square of 9 by 9 meters. Walking through the area, the main character noted in his thoughts that, as he thought, he was trapped and someone had locked him in. Stopping, Will suddenly looked away and noted that the sound in front of him was a door from which rays of light were breaking through. Will stated that it was an iron door. Covering his face with his hand, the main character screamed that he was about to go blind. In his thoughts, he emphasized that he didn't care about this and that he had to go. Walking towards the light, Will noted that there was someone there and only a little distance left. His gaze fell on the shadow from the small window. The window and the door closed. The main character was dumbfounded. Tears began to stream down his face as he felt streams of steam hovering in front of him. Taken aback, Will asked what it smelled like and whether it was food. He looked at the plate that stood under the door. The main character took a deep breath of the smell of food. Holding the plate of food in front of him, Will noted in his mind that it was rotten fish, tea leaves, pork that looked like leftover meat, and torn bones. The main character emphasized that these were leftovers from about 5 dishes. He pictured several outlines of men. Will noted that it was unlikely that one person ate it all, adding that he was being mocked. Will told himself to endure it. The main character started eating, telling himself to endure it all to survive. It has been at least 4 months since Pyo Wool was trapped in the abyss. During this time, he was training continuously. Once a day, food was provided to him through a small door. They never spoke a word besides this. Wool trained throughout his time in the abyss. He had already adapted and was able to recognize things in his surroundings. Many insects lived there without emitting any light. Wool wondered if they were centipedes. Suddenly, a white snake coiled around the protagonist's hand. Without warning, it attacked and bit his hand. The protagonist, Wool, was in intense pain. It felt as if his body were on fire. He suspected it was due to the snake's venom. The venom caused excruciating agony throughout his body. Suddenly, the small door through which his food was brought opened. Pyo-Wool took the food and declared that he would not die no matter what happened to him. He took the food and ate it desperately. After some time had passed, Wool was lying on the wall, and he could now see the snake properly. He was able to see clearly in the dark due to some change that had occurred during his detoxifying process. He found it fascinating and recalled hearing that a person becomes stronger after being poisoned. Wool decided to let the snake bite him again. He experienced pain similar to being on fire, but it wasn't as severe as the first bite. Wool thought that only he and the snake possessed intelligence in the darkness. While he was lost in thought, he heard a vibration coming from the door. He looked at the closed door. Wool said in his thoughts that he must survive. The main character noted that there were 20 steps to the next room and was unsurprised not to feel the presence of others. He opened the door and was taken aback by the smell emanating from within. Wool recoiled at the stench, and his gaze fell upon the corpse lying on the ground. The main character detected the odor of rotting flesh and, although he couldn't see clearly, inferred from their physique that they were of similar age. He wondered if the situation was the same in the other rooms. Continuing down the corridor, Wool was startled by a massive stone gate. Placing his hands on the doors, the main character observed that this was the door to the corridor and noted that someone had removed the bolt. Wool began to open the door, pushing it aside with his hands. Several people stood before him, including a guy and a girl who looked at him with curiosity. Wool, surprised and uncertain, gazed back with a sparkle in his eyes. The pair seemed to be waiting for him. He approached them, remaining silent, but eventually decided to make the first move. They were both quite astonished by his presence. He continued forward, inspecting the rooms. Looking into the next room, he realized that the same scenario was unfolding as in the others. He turned to her and asked who she was. She seemed very excited and inquired where he had come from, noting that they were the only survivors with him. Wool looked at her silently and thought she seemed to be looking in his direction but not actually seeing him. It appeared that only he could see in the dark. Wool decided to introduce himself, explaining that he was locked in the next section. The girl was shocked by his words and asked if there were really other sections. He confirmed there were. He then asked for their names. She introduced herself as So Yeol and indicated that the boy next to her was Song Chanhwa. Wool regarded her with a blank expression and then, standing behind them, told them to follow him. They turned toward his voice, questioning where they were going. Wool continued forward, informing them that they were heading to other sections. They soon encountered another door. Wool observed another corpse in the room. Unlike his section, where people mostly died of hunger, he noted that most had died by their own hands. There were plates of food, much more than in his section, leading him to question if everyone was treated differently. He stared with wide eyes, puzzled by the apparent discrimination. Suddenly, Yeol called him over, and he heard her say that everyone had been locked up around the same time with this large group. They decided to proceed through the cave, advancing deeper. They arrived at a huge door, which Wool began to open with his fingers. When the door opened, they saw a very bright light. The others were frightened and had to close their eyes due to the brightness. Wool's eyes hurt similarly from the light, and he didn't understand how they ended up outside. However, he realized they were still underground. The light came from a torch, and after being in darkness for so long, Even such a small light was blinding. They were still in the cave, which had 2 torches. Wool was amazed to see small houses within the cave, and a crowd began moving towards them. They all started to inspect what was inside. Wool saw that there was no one in the houses. You all wondered how to understand this and where everyone had gone. Wool observed that the structure was hastily constructed and barely held together. He recalled the building's interior and speculated on the purpose of these flimsy structures, which seemed merely decorative. He turned his head when someone called out to him. A girl with white hair looked at him, her eyes full of sparks. She introduced herself as Lee Min and expressed that she was counting on him. Wool looked at her with slight surprise and remained silent. She moved closer, placed her hand on his cheek, and asked if he had always been like this. Wool didn't initially understand what she meant. She stroked his cheek, commenting that his red pupils looked beautiful in the torchlight. Wool then recalled the red-eyed snake and realized that his eyes likely changed due to its bite. He decided he didn't want to stand out in such a place. She began lowering her hand from his cheek, saying that the red shine of his eyes was noticeable only in the torchlight and otherwise they were nearly imperceptible. Wool, who hadn't noticed this change, was relieved she hadn't figured out everything. She asked what he was thinking about, and he fabricated an excuse, saying he was contemplating various things. Her eyes sparkled even more, and she said he was different from the others. Wool was surprised and asked why. She smiled sweetly, stating that it was just her impression. While everyone else was confused, Wool managed to think clearly. Sweat dripped down his cheek, and he was slightly taken aback, unsure of what to say. Yeowol and Chanwoo approached them, asking what they were talking about. Lehman replied that they were discussing random topics. Yeowol, with a bit of disbelief and curiosity, smiled and said they had decided to team up. Wool and Lee Min were surprised. Yeowol gestured that they could join them. Wool closed his eyes and looked down, saying he would consider their offer. Yeowol and Chanwoo were surprised and questioned why he wouldn't join them. Wool said he wanted to observe the situation first. Yeowol was taken aback and silent. She then smiled and said he could join if he changed his mind. She turned to Lee Min, asking if she would join their group. Lee Min, smiling, extended her hand, saying that being together increased their chances of survival. Wool silently observed, realizing they had been there longer than him and doubted their sanity. While they spoke, he decided to observe from a distance. He noticed several groups that had formed quickly, despite their brief acquaintance. Yeowol and Chanwoo were leaders of one group. Another leader was a guy with a ponytail named King Il. Yomail Young, with red hair, was the second to last leader, and the final leader was a blonde named Go Yongsan. The main character was a loner and did not join any group. Behind his back, others whispered about him, speculating that he might have killed everyone in his section and did not want anyone to join him. Will realize that no matter where he ended up, people were consistently the same. He decided to disregard them, walking up to a stone wall, smoothing it with his hand. He observed the houses and realized they were recently built. He touched the moss and noted that although the houses were recent, the dungeon was ancient. Someone had merely repurposed it. He gazed upwards, understanding that, despite everything, he was incredibly fortunate. A simple worker couldn't have managed this. Suddenly, stones fell from the ceiling, revealing sunlight. Wool was amazed, unable to believe his eyes. A basket of food descended through the hole, and the children eagerly eyed it. The basket contained a significant amount of food. Everyone rushed to grab it, but Yeowol blocked with her hands. She pushed away the outstretched hands, facing anger and frustration from those denied food. Yeowol, smiling, proposed dividing the food equally. The others looked at their leaders, waiting for a response. They remained silent, pondering her proposal. Approaching Yeowol, they said that as group representatives, they would handle it. Wool intervened, demanding his share with a confident tone. As he reached into the basket, the red-haired Al-Yung grabbed his hand, shouting for him to leave. Wool responded with passive aggression, stating no one would touch the food without permission. He insisted that they controlled the basket's contents. The sparkle in Wool's eyes intensified. He managed to free his hand from Young's grip and retaliated by poking Juna's eyes. The onlookers were horrified as Wool continued to attack. He choked Young, demanding him to repeat his words. Juna, in pain, could barely respond. Wool, with increasing rage, threatened to make him blind if he persisted. The crowd shouted for Wool to stop. Wool glared at them angrily, but continued to hurt Young. They were terrified, noting that Wool's gaze resembled the snake's. Yoel approached, asking Wool to release Young, explaining that he wouldn't get an answer from him. She then looked at Wool, confirming that no one would touch his share. She asked everyone if this was true, and the other leaders, fearful, nodded in agreement. Wool released Young, who clutched his eyes in pain, his hands trembling. Wool, with an arrogant look, asked if Young didn't need a second eye. He then moved towards the basket of food. Later, everyone sat and ate the food from the basket. Wool, seated apart, watched them attempt to bond. He ate his share, realizing it was a test to identify useful individuals. He recalled the corpses and guessed this was the beginning of a process that would continue until their goal was achieved, with many dying along the way. As he ate, he thought the survivors might become his enemies. Yoel approached him, inquiring how he felt with everyone against him. Many had left Young's group. Wool, looking at her sideways, remarked that her group had grown significantly. She smiled, noting he had been observing her all along. He proudly stated that, like them, he was watching them. Observing her, he realized she had taken the most food for her group but had eaten the least. The children trusted Yoel, and she stood out among the leaders. Yoel asked why Wool still lived in that dark room, suggesting it was due to fear of him. He said he was comfortable there and revealed bite marks on his arm, which he used to boost his immunity. He noted that he had stopped feeling the bites, indicating his body had adapted. Yoel leaned closer, inviting him to join her. Wool, closing his eyes and muttering displeasedly, reiterated his disinterest. Suddenly, they noticed the basket of food descending towards them again. King shouted that everyone should be smart this time and avoid climbing into the basket unless they wanted to risk falling when the rope was cut. When they saw the basket, they were alarmed to find it contained only a fraction of the previous amount. Wool closed his eyes and tilted, while Yoel was surprised. Opening his eyes slightly, he realized that what he had suspected had begun. He saw a boy with brown hair and eyes of the same color, Makno Sam, one of the survivors from the last sector, who had joined Yoel's group. He was found to be dead. His death was because of his weakness and flaws. Chanwoo was furious and told to avenge him. Yoel replied vengeance is not important, but the person of her group is dead, which is important matter. He told Chanwoo to take revenge in exact same way as he died. Pyawal looked at the crowd, knowing that the weakest of the other group would be next. He glanced at them with a confident look, as if to say that the war had begun. Another guy was lying covered in blood on the rubble. It was the weakest of the young Sense group. Then, a series of murders began. Every morning, a new body was found, first from the Yoel group, then from Zhang Young-sang's, and the deaths continued without end. We see a distraught man with red eyes because, back then, no one trusted anyone. The children had turned into hungry, bloodthirsty demons. Ball tore moss from the walls. This was his food. As he chewed it, he muttered that the food was disgusting, something he still couldn't get used to. He stood near a huge wall of moss, realizing that the others had not yet reached this point. Suddenly, the light of a torch shone near him. He squinted his eyes, understanding that his peace and quiet wouldn't last much longer. A crowd was approaching him, ready to tear him apart. He looked at them, standing in complete darkness, and realized they had come for him. He began to count, trying to figure out how many had come, and it turned out that 4 people were after him. Someone from the crowd asked if he was there. They held a torch and insisted they were sure he was nearby because they had seen him come this way. It was Young and his squad. Suddenly, Young bared his teeth in anger, shouting and demanding to know where he was hiding. He looked around, thinking he had already killed 2, and now it was the turn of the 3rd. They walked further, still unsure of his location. One of the guys started screaming furiously, falling on his back, claiming something had bitten him. It was a snake, which slithered away while they were busy fearing for their comrade. The bitten guy lay on the floor, dying from the poison. Young began shouting frantically, warning everyone to stay alert. Suddenly, the guy holding the torch disappeared. Young screamed even louder, Now there were only two of them left. He told Wool to get out as soon as possible. But then, Wool appeared behind the last member of his squad, grabbed him by the neck, and began to choke him. Young, hearing the screams, turned around and was shocked to see his teammate being mercilessly strangled by Wool. Young began to grit his teeth, anger and sweat breaking out as his friend gasped for air. He clenched his fists and screamed at Wool to let him go. Wool looked at him, realizing that at this rate, the man would soon die from suffocation. Young grabbed Wool's hands, trying to pry them off. Wool himself understood that he was about to become a killer. He looked at Young, as if contemplating whether it would be better to leave him alive. At the last moment, Wool let go of the lifeless body in front of Young's eyes. Young stared at the corpse, knowing that sooner or later, this had to happen. His mind filled with anger and hatred, and he shouted that Wool had just killed his people. But Wool merely looked at him seriously and stayed silent. Young's pupils narrowed as he rushed at Wool, screaming in rage, but Wool easily dodged each of his blows. Young seemed to have lost his mind, continuing to strike at Wool while shouting. He delivered a powerful sweeping blow, but suddenly, Wool disappeared. It was as if Young was left completely alone on the battlefield. He began turning around, frantically asking where Wool had gone, shouting at him to stop hiding and come out to fight. But right behind him, Wool stood, telling him not to hope for mercy this time. Young was terrified and began to run away, squealing in fear. But he stopped abruptly and decided to look back. Pyawal stood there, just staring at him. But as Young was pressed against the wall, Pyawal began to slowly approach, his footsteps echoing loudly throughout the hall. Young was so scared that words couldn't describe it. Wool just looked at him with a confident gaze. Young began to sweat from fear, his eyes turning red. He put his hands forward, screaming in terror for Wool to stop and begged him to eat. Wool frowned, not understanding the situation. Young, using his last strength, tried to persuade him, saying that one person alone couldn't cope against a crowd, so they should work together. He even offered to let Wool be in charge, promising to obey him in everything because he wasn't like the others Wool had killed. He could be useful. Wool narrowed his eyes at these words, but still continued to walk slowly toward him. Sweat dripped from Young's face as he shouted that if Wool wanted, he could be the leader, and Young would follow him obediently. Wool walked right up to him, while Young trembled with fear. Then, with a very creepy look, Wool said that he would obey him, but only if Wool was sure that Young wouldn't become bold again and try something. Young was terrified by these words and began shouting that Wool was mistaken. Wool waved his hand and crouched down. Young was very surprised by what happened next. Wool hit him on the chin with all his might. The force of the blow sent his head flying back, and before he could react, Wool immediately pounced on him, performing a chokehold. He squeezed his hands tighter and tighter, continuing to choke Young. Tears streamed from Young's eyes, and drool dripped from his mouth as he screamed for Wool to spare him. But Wool's grip only relaxed when Young had died. Wool let the lifeless body fall to the floor. Then, looking at it, he shouted that he had only killed him because he was still weak. After these words, Wool began to leave the place, his eyes glowing with bright red light and hatred. He walked further and further away from the dead bodies.